안녕하세요. 핫 히스토리언의 더 달리운 에피소드에 오신 것을 환영합니다. In this video, I'll be talking about a traditional Korean hat that has experienced something of a revival in popular conscience. The Gat. The Gat is a traditional Korean hat most closely associated with the late Joseon dynasty, which ruled the Korean peninsula from 1392 to 1897, though it does predate it. There are many types that exist, each with their own connotations, with the word Gat being a generic term in Korean for a wide-brimmed hat. But the best known nowadays, a version of which I am currently wearing, is the hanboks or hanboks, which is a translucent hat traditionally made of black horsehair woven over a bamboo frame, which was worn by the nobility and civil servants of Joseon Korea. While it mostly vanished in daily wear in the 20th century, it is experiencing something of a revival in popular conscience thanks to the popularity of historical K-dramas. So let us examine this particular piece of headwear more closely. Hairstyles and headwear held particular cultural and societal importance in Joseon Korea. There were strict codes of hierarchy and symbolism attached to what men wore on their heads, and there were so many styles with so much importance attached to them that Korea was sometimes called the land of hats by foreign envoys or missionaries, something this channel can only approve of. Part of this importance can be attributed to the Neo-Confucian societal hierarchy that dominated, and in some ways continues to influence, Korean society for centuries. Neo-Confucianism is a philosophy that developed in China in the 12th century, from a melding of traditional Confucian teachings and elements of Taoism and Buddhism. It rapidly gained traction in imperial China and spread to various neighboring countries, including Korea. There, it became the state ideology of the Joseon dynasty, which had replaced the Goryeo dynasty at the end of the 14th century. It gradually replaced the traditional Buddhism there, and by the 16th century had cemented itself as the dominant code by which society was governed. While it varied from century to century, one major precept of Korean Neo-Confucianism was the establishment of a strict hierarchy in society, maintained through rituals and behaviors. One highly important relationship is the subservience of a child to a parent, and by extension of a younger man to his elders. In Neo-Confucian philosophy, a man's body, particularly his hair, was not his own, but belonged to his parents. Thus, it was considered a disrespect to them to cut it, and so letting it grow out was a mark of filial piety. Korean men in this era therefore tended to have long queues, which they gathered up on the top of their head in a top knot, often tied so tight as to be painful. This knot was then usually adorned with a small cover to help maintain it in place. This top knot held great importance, as it signified both respect for one's elders and having reached manhood, usually only being worn by married men, though some unmarried ones would sometimes wear one to avoid discrimination. However, despite this cultural importance, etiquette dictated, especially amongst higher classes, that it not be shown bare at any time, even within one's own house, as that was considered indecent other than when sleeping. Therefore, they adopted various hats depending on the situation to both cover their knot and enhance their appearance. Some were smaller for wear indoors, and a high official had a whole variety of ceremonial hats, but outdoors a large hat with a brim was preferred, the Gat. Such hats had existed for centuries to help shield workers out in the fields from the sun, similar to headgear worn in neighboring countries. The hanboks Gat that is so famous is likely descended from similarly shaped bamboo hats, notably the parengi, a hat made of split bamboo that was often worn by peasants and commoners throughout Korea. Representations seem to indicate forms of it to have existed as far back as the Three Kingdoms era, which took place from the 1st century BC to the 7th AD. By the Goryeo dynasty, more elaborate lacquered black versions appeared for noblemen who wanted to mark their status. This hierarchy began to develop in the Goryeo dynasty, but by the time the Joseon came around, it had become quite rigid. The black horsehair hangnip was reserved for the yangban, aristocrats and ruling classes, and those who had passed the highly important civil service exam known locally as the gwagyo, which allowed them to take up positions in the government bureaucracy and therefore afforded much advancement. During all this time, the shape of the Gat evolved slightly depending on the era, region, or even taste of the wearer, from a rounded top to a more truncated cone-shaped appearance. The appearance most familiar to people today, looking somewhat like an overlarge top hat, seems to have become standardized around the time of the reign of Yongsangun at the turn of the 16th century. Its size varied enormously, from a relatively small brim with a large crown to tiny crowns and oversized brims. Any yangban would find it inconceivable to be seen in public without his gat, and it was therefore considered essential. The size could also be influenced by the opinion of the king, with King Sukjong, who found that his courtiers' gats had become too extravagant and ordered them to adopt smaller, more restrained versions. Meanwhile, outside the aristocracy, the pyrengi, of course, continued to be worn for practical reasons, but in between, the middle class tended to wear the chorip, which has a very similar shape but is made of bamboo straw. It can be seen as the midway point between the peasant's hat and the formal black gat. It also shows that, beyond the marker of status in the social class, the hoorkrip was also a marker of age status, as only those who had achieved manhood could wear it. The gat was not designed to sit low on the head, but to be almost delicately balanced on top, looking to modernize like it is much too small. Underneath, a man would first wrap his hair and top knot in a tight headband. Then the gat would be placed atop the knot and secured under the chin with a silk ribbon to make sure it stayed in place. Beyond this practical chin strap, there was another, called a paeyong, often richly decorated with beads, that would hang very loose across the chest and was purely decorative. Its presence forced the wearer to adopt a slow and dignified gait, as rushing would cause it to bounce and become tangled, which was frowned upon. While black was the standard color for the nobility, and plain bamboo for the middle and peasant classes, other colors existed which had their own significance. A white gat was a sign of mourning, and a red one was reserved for military officers and advisors. This red version, with twin plumes on either side, also eventually became an attribute of shamans by the end of the Joseon dynasty. The gat continued to be an essential part of menswear throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. It is also during this time, around the reign of Yongzhou, that it took the shape that is most often depicted today. It continued to be the attribute of nobility and scholars until the last years of the Joseon dynasty, when Japanese influence in Korean affairs began to cause rapid and turbulent societal changes. Korea had for centuries been a nominally independent tributary state of the Chinese Empire, but with Japan rapidly seeking to expand its influence in the region and eyeing the Korean peninsula as a potential colony, a series of incidents orchestrated by it led to conflict which culminated in them taking control of the palace and in 1885 Korea declaring its full independence from China. This had societal implications, as Japan sought to modernize, as they put it, Korea, mostly in a bid to distance it from its Chinese past. One such reform was the banning of top knots, a radical change resisted by many and even led to riots. However, as part of these reforms, the yangban class was officially abolished, though it continued in practice, and the black gat was authorized for wear by anybody who desired. Court dress, however, became westernized, adopting uniforms rather than hanboks. In rural areas, though, traditional gats remained the norm. After the establishment of the Korean Empire in 1887, Japan continued to exert pressure, first by making it a protectorate in 1905, and then annexing it in 1910, ending the rule of Korean royalty. From then on, an aggressive and sometimes brutal process of Japanization took place, with the often systematic suppression or erasure of Korean cultural elements, from monuments to names to language, with the Gyeongbokgung Palace, for example, the former royal residence, being demolished and replaced with a colonial administration building. However, at first, the wearing of gats actually expanded, as, freed from the class restrictions imposed on it before, now anybody could wear it, and many did to project higher status, with it even being mass-produced. Wearing traditional Korean clothing was also seen as an act of resistance to Japanese rule. However, as the century progressed, the ruling classes, usually Japanese, though sometimes including collaborating former yangban, wore Japanese-style suits or uniforms, and the gat as a status symbol began to fade into folklore. By the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, and the restoration of Korean independence, with the country split into North and South Korea, the gat as an everyday wear hat had thoroughly disappeared. Westernization and internationalization had taken hold, and traditional clothing was now reserved for special occasions. While it is not seen as an essential part of men's attire or worn every day anymore, the gat still retains an important place in Korean culture. It is often worn at events where traditional garb, the hanbok, is worn, notably at traditional Korean weddings, or reenactments of historic events in both Koreas. It is also worn by tourists at many national historical sites in South Korea, such as the Gyeongbokgung Palace, for example, as entry to such monuments is free to anyone who comes wearing traditional clothing. This is part of a government initiative to raise awareness about Korean historical outfits and help create an ambiance of times past, which I think is a great idea. With this, most monuments have stores surrounding them renting such outfits, and many men wear gats as part of them. But one of the most influential forces in the revival of the Gat in popular culture is the success in recent years of Korean TV shows, colloquially known as K-dramas, many of which take place in Joseon times. Of note are the show Kingdom, a show set in a fictionalized Joseon under threat of zombies, and the recent animated film K-pop Demon Hunters, for example. They have created a great interest in historical Korean culture, not only at home, but abroad, and the Gat, so easily recognizable, has become one of the most visible items of this interest. From a simple peasant hat to a sign of status and nobility, to now a symbol of Korean culture, the Gat has had a long history. Whether of bamboo, lacquer, or horsehair, it is one of the most distinctive and recognizable hats in all of Asia, and while it is not worn as widely as it once was, thanks to the renewed interest in Korean culture, both at home and abroad, seems to have a bright future as a mark of Koreans' pride in their history. So I hope once again you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you. Small brim with a large crown